Hi everyone, this is Nina Kolodij, and I'm going to be narrating this PowerPoint that was presented with Dr. Susan Swanberg at the Southwest Popular and American Cultural Association Conference in Albuquerque, New Mexico, February 2020. Our presentation was called Art and Music as a Means of Conveying Information about the State of the Planet. I'm going to skip over our information card in case you want to get in touch. I'm going to spend too much time on that. So here's a little bit of an overview of what I'm going to talk about. First, I would like to try to define science communication about as well as I can. I'm going to talk about the three major models of science communication, as well as the cultural cognition thesis, which will give you a better idea of how and why people make decisions. I'm going to talk about accepting decision-relevant science, so science that requires a decision to be made about it. I'm going to talk about the art of planetary science, the art show put on at the University of Arizona, as well as the 11 artists that I interviewed who are related or took part in this art show, as well as the conclusions I came to based on these interviews. So first, what is science communication? It's a lot of things. It's really hard to define. Part of it is scientific literacy, so competence or knowledge about scientific topics. Do people know about science and what's going on? But there's also public awareness of science. So is the public informed on scientific issues? Is the public as a general whole interested, aware of what's going on, looking to learn more about things? Science communication is the entire process of doing research in science, carrying out experience, planning experiments, and then spreading awareness about that. So telling people about it, writing news articles, teaching in classes, and then inspiring the public to engage with the science and inspiring them to want to know more. There are a couple of stakeholder groups involved. So first are the scientists, whether that be in academia, in government and industry positions, the people who are planning, carrying out, and analyzing experiments and data. Next are the mediators. So anyone who is a middleman communicator, that would be that journalists, educators, illustrators, and artists, anyone who is taking science and translating it for the public, which is our next stakeholder group. So members of the general population who are responsible for, reacting to these issues, responding to these issues, doing what needs to be done based on the data presented to them. Next are the policy influencers who actually make the policy. So government officials, judiciary, people like that. But that also includes advocate and lobbying groups, people who influence how policy is made. So the first model of communication, probably the oldest model, is the deficit model, also known as the dissemination model, which relies on the fact that there's a deficit of information. So it's basically a one-way monologue from scientists to mediators and mediators to the public to try to fix that deficit. Because the public is lacking information, facts, and education, they can't see the whole picture. They can't feasibly study everything there is in science. And because they can't see that whole picture, there's controversy. Educating the public will fix that deficit and will result in the public judging issues like scientists. So the mediator is responsible for maintaining that flow of information and making sure people get the information they need. So here's a quote just from one of my websites. The deficit model boils down to this. If we just stuff them full of facts, they'll all use the scientific method to come to the most reasonable conclusion in exactly the same way. So if they have the information, there shouldn't be any controversy because logically everyone should come to the same conclusion. Next is the dialogue model, which is kind of the next step, and it introduces an emphasis on context about research. So it lets people provide feedback, so the public is able to criticize, is research valid? Is it translated properly by a mediator? They're allowed to provide information and opinions on, do they like the science that's going on? Do they think people did a good job researching it? And it all leads to the fact that two heads are better than one. So here's just a quote about the dialogue model. Context and involvement breeds confidence and motivation in the stakeholders involved in the discussion, especially for members of the public who have been left out of an endless stream of scientific discoveries and the policymaking that sometimes follows. So it helps people feel involved, even though the burden of the actual science is still mostly on the scientists. Most of the planning and execution and research is still done on the science end rather than on the other stakeholder end. Which brings us to the participation model. So the participation model allows people to actively participate in generating the science. For example, citizen science projects like the Southwest Monarch Study that lets people report viewings of monarch butterflies, tag them in order to follow their migration paths and things like that. It allows for the public to assist in every part of the scientific process, not just hearing about it or getting feedback in the end. It creates a shared identity, equality, and a unifying character. So instead of splitting people up into stakeholder groups, it puts everybody on the same playing field and lets the public and other stakeholders make decisions about what, research is actually being done. So this is a democratization of science, and it leads to a more open-minded public, so they're not stuck in somewhere where they're not allowed to be involved and feel like they're worth something. Here's a quote that I took from somebody else's defense. I thought it was really interesting and then explains the models really well. So whereas the deficit model focuses on the transmission of knowledge, and whereas the dialogue model focuses on the discussion of the implications of knowledge, the participation model of science communication focuses on the co-production of knowledge by scientific experts and the lay public. So here we come to the cultural cognition thesis, which relates to the models of science communication, especially for the deficit model, for example, where it relies on the fact that if people have information, they're going to logically make decisions. Humans don't always make decisions logically and rationally. They're going to gravitate towards beliefs they already agree with, they're already interested in, so they're going to want to read something that you're already interested in. If you don't like sloths, for example, you're not going to read stories about sloths. The cultural cognition thesis also mentions the fact that the public are going to question the credibility of experts and their conclusions. So they might believe that someone is an expert in their field, but they might decide, well, they really didn't study this data properly and came to the wrong conclusion. So, for example, if you have someone who's more individualistic, they might value big business a lot. So saying something like the coal industry needs to be destroyed and it's horrible and the worst thing ever isn't going to make them interested in, say, nuclear power. If you present it some way that's different, that doesn't threaten their values, for example, nuclear power might be a good option for clean energy, then they're more likely to be open-minded towards that. So you need solutions that don't threaten the values of any group, because people aren't rational, they're more emotional. Building off of this is Kahan's decision-relevant science. So the public sometimes struggle to accept decision-relevant science, which is science that requires a decision to be made. So for example, with climate change, there are decisions that need to be made to either reduce emissions, for example, or keep going on the path we're on. And there's 4 points that Kahan kind of talks about how people make decision-relevant science. So the first one is the public has to accept that there's too much science that they can verify themselves. They're going to need someone else to help them verify and learn about different kinds of science. There's just a lot of it. They have to be able to recognize that it's decision relevant in order to use it. So they have to be able to recognize that they have to make decisions about it. They can't just learn about it and then move along. Kahan talks about the fact that people struggle to recognize, they struggle to accept decision relevant science because they don't recognize it as decision relevant, not because they don't understand the science itself. So they might understand that leaving the lights on all day long when you're not at home is taking up the power, but they might not realize that they have to change make a decision about that in order to help the climate, I guess. And then finally, cultural cognition plays a big part in this. People tend to align with values they already agree with. So if they align with a certain peer group or belief, behavior, then they're going to lean towards that instead of accepting something different. Along with that is also Penny Cook and Rand's ideas that humans are mentally lazy, which is an interesting way to put it, but it's kind of true in a way that we don't always use critical thinking to make decisions. I don't like making decisions. It's a lot of work. You're not always going to sit there and research something for a whole bunch of hours before making a decision. So it motivates people to go with their gut a lot of the time. Penny Cook and Rand also talk about the fact that prior exposure and repetition increases the likelihood of accepting statements as true. So if you hear something over and over and over again, you're more likely to accept it as true even if you know that it's not. Or even if you learn later that it's not, you're more likely to still believe there's truth in it. This partially has to do with the fact that scientific experts and humanities scholars have difficulty communicating sometimes. There are a lot of stereotypes and biases on both sides, but there's some sort of difficulty communicating with scientists in humanities, scientists in the public, that seems to be affecting the fact that people have difficulty accepting decision-relevant science. So the art of planetary science, finally working around to communicating with art, it's a art show put on by the Lunar Planetary Laboratory at the University of Arizona. And here's just a quote about the purpose of the show from Alison McGraw, who was the graduate student organizer. And she says, "How can we visualize our science for the public? And then on the same note, invite members of the public to express what they see about space and the solar system in the universe." So here's just some pictures and information about the show. Like I said, it's run by the Lunar and Planetary Laboratory, but it is entirely graduate student run. So grad students plan it, they organize it, they gather the artwork, they facilitate the actual show, which is a 3-day event, usually in the fall semester. It started in 2013 and has run every year since, except in 2016, I think it was, where they didn't have a show. The grad students just didn't want to do it. But what's really cool is they also include bonus activities. So you see in the bottom right corner, there's a picture of the physics bus, which is basically a hands-on classroom on wheels to teach people about physics and science that way. They set up a telescope on the lawn during the event, one of the nights, so people can look through the telescope and see what's going on in the sky. They have a band that plays that is named with science themed. So a whole bunch of things like that. There are 2 categories that artists can submit to for the art of planetary science. First is fine art, and you can see examples of that. That's basically what most people think of when they hear the word art. Paintings, digital illustrations, sculptures, photographs, jewelry, everything in that sort of zone. It's anything influenced by planetary topics in that sort of fine traditional kind of art. The other category is data art, which is scientists presenting their research data or models as art. For example, the picture there are orbital dynamics. Someone tracked orbits and it turned out to be really pretty, really art-like. So that's an example of that, but it's also art inspired by scientific data and models. So you'll see an example of that later in temperature scarves. I talked to the woman who made the temperature scarves, and I'll talk about it in a future slide. Here's just a little more information about the show. So the red line, you can see 2016, there was no show. And in 2018, there's a weird dip in attendance because they only collected attendance on one of the 3 nights. But basically, you can see overall the number of artists submitting art is increasing. The number of submissions is increasing, so artists are welcome to submit more than one piece. And the number of attendees has generally been increasing as well. 2019, the most recent show, was the most highly attended. You can see that weird dip. It's marked in red in 2018 when they only monitored for one of the 3 nights. So that's why that's there. So these are the interviews. This is about the interviews that I conducted. The interviewees see themselves primarily as. So some of them saw themselves primarily at the time as artists, 2 as scientists, 3 as both, and 1 specifically as neither. And this is super subjective. It's basically what the artists and scientists and everyone who submitted that I talked to thought of themselves mostly as. Here's just some pictures of the artists. Technically, there are all artists because they submitted to an art show. But there's me and one of the artists with Tactile Moon. And on the right is Tyler Mang, a grad student who submitted his art. All right, so here are some quotes and images from the interviewees. The first person I talked to was all the way from Turkey, and she was inspired by how much Jupiter looked like a Van Gogh painting. So she painted Van Gogh's reality on Jupiter, and she says, the mystery of space, the relativity of time, gives us different perspectives and makes our lives more meaningful by expanding our imagination and increasing our admiration for the universe. We make sense of our existence in the world with science and art. Next is another Van Gogh-inspired painting by a Tucson local who's also a docent at Kitt Peak. And what he does is he takes giant images taken by NASA in the public domain, and he paints over them to give them texture and life and more of an artistic kind of flair. He was also inspired by how much pictures of Jupiter look like something that Van Gogh would have painted hundreds of years ago. Or 100 years ago, however many. But he says, I just love how nature presents itself as art. When we explore space, that's what we're finding. That was the whole idea, to attract a different kind of people that would be more interested in art than science, that see art as science or representing scientific things. Next is a artist who is now in Phoenix. She works as a digital kind of graphic designer for NASA, but she's also pursuing a degree in engineering, which is really cool. So she's kind of one of those both individuals that I talked to. Her piece is called Looking to the Future, and she said, I think it's really important to be able to promote science in a different way because it can be really unappealing to some people. If we can get it on a relatable level, if someone can see something that evokes an emotional response to them, as opposed to just, here's a bunch of graphs, that is how you get more people on board with your message. Next are the temperature scarves I mentioned earlier, created by Brenda Wetner in Tucson. So every single line on these scarves is a day of temperature data. So the entire scarf is 1 year of temperature data. So you can see the ones she presented at the show were for Tucson. There's a lot of red, warm days in the middle. But she has done cities from all over the world, Dublin, Newark, California, everything. And she just has a whole bunch of these temperature scarves. So she took actual data and made some kind of art. But she was the person I talked to who didn't consider her work to be art, which was kind of interesting. But she said, science touches our lives in every single way. You know, there's chemistry in cooking, and there's physics in riding a bike, and all these things are not separate. I think the art of planetary science is trying to show that it's not just a cup of tea or your bicycle, it's the planet and the whole solar system. The larger universe, it has a beauty to it as well. Let's celebrate that. So next is Tactile Moon, and you saw that in a picture earlier by Chrysanthi Caperonis in Tucson. And what's interesting about this piece is that it's made to be touched. The acrylics are safe for touching. It's very textured, and the elevation, or the colors are roughly based on elevation data to see, you know, where on the moon there's high points and low points and big crater impacts. And so most of the time art isn't usually made to be touched, but this is kind of Chrysanthi's way of making art more accessible to those who might be visually impaired or those who just want to touch and are kinesthetic learners. So she says, I think to help people that don't understand science or are afraid of science, I think it's really up to the professor to be open to bringing in visuals. even if it's an illustration, it doesn't have to be like fine art. It can be illustrations and color. It really helps because someone is going to stare at that and they're going to look at it and they'll be intrigued by it. Next is another physical kind of art called Touching the Solar System. Dr. Steve Kortenkamp is a professor in the Astronomy Planetary Science Department on campus, and his art is 3D models of impact craters. So his previous research was about impact craters and impacts in general, and now he's taken those models and printed them out to help people who might be visually impaired or just show them something that they can touch. They can feel, the crater, the different types. The big picture is a meteor crater in Arizona, and the top ones are the ones he showed at the show. And he says, I think everybody has that communication problem. You get to be some kind of an expert in something, and without really critically thinking about it, you would have a hard time communicating to someone who hasn't been immersed in whatever that thing is. If you're not in that area, you're maybe a little reluctant to speak up and say, I don't quite understand that, or I disagree with what you're saying. Next is someone who definitely considers herself to be mostly an artist. Her piece in the beginning is a representation kind of the Big Bang, obviously a very abstract one, with the emptiness in the middle and the colors and shapes exploding outwards. And she says, everybody comes to art with their own background. So when they look at the artwork, they're bringing their experiences and stories to create what they're going to want to see. Because a lot of people, when they look at abstract art, they want to see something. That's why when I title things, I used to just title things Untitled A, Untitled B, Untitled C. Well, that's not helpful. I think people need a point of departure as far as when they're looking at something so abstract so they can ground themselves and create their stories from their experiences. And that's totally true for both art and science. People need a place to start to be able to want to learn about it and find it interesting and love it and understand it. Next is one of my favorite pieces by Tyler Mang, who is a grad student at the University of Arizona. It's called Beauty in the Basal Reflection. So the actual aurora-looking thing is a subterranean underground glacial profile. So he took what is the shape of an underground glacier and put it in the sky to look like an aurora. And the bonus to that is the colors that he used. So I've included a chart on the side of that with the matter color scale highlighted. And this is actually a series of published kind of standardized color scales in an oceanography paper, just so people can use these colors to know what's going on in oceanography research. So he used underground glacier data with an oceanography color palette in the sky, and it looks just like an aurora. So I thought that was really cool. And he says, if it's just numbers, it's not always super interesting. Different audiences, I think, that's something that's important to consider. But yeah, data visualization in a peer-reviewed article is still really important to efficiently complement the text in your paper. It's important to have those visuals too. Next is Genesis from an artist all the way in Iowa who is studying some sort of visual biology major. I forget exactly what it's called, and I don't want to get it wrong, but it's a visual biological visualization, I think is what it was. So she's definitely one of those both science and artist individuals. She shipped her art all the way from Iowa to participate in this show. And she says, I think that you can show so much more with an illustration or art or something. I think that once you've done something for so long and you've worked around people who have also done the same thing for so long, you kind of have a completely different language. And it's really hard to communicate with people who, have never done anything in the field or really know the language of that field. Next is definitely an interesting one called The Past Will Show Us Our Futures. So you can see the space elements in the color palette, the planety kind of shapes, but there's also a super southwest element with the kind of fencing, tied together sticks, pieces of wood. So that's an interesting combination representation of a science topic in art. And this artist says, science is intimidating to a great number of people. It often seems far away and difficult to understand. having the opportunity to see so many different representations and ideas, having the opportunity to talk to scientists, artists, and aficionados in that venue is a great way to spread the word of why it's all so important. Next is another one of my favorites called Sample Sites Reconnaissance Birds. So Zoe Sesut is working on the OSIRIS-REx project to the asteroid Bennu, which is something a lot of people around here have heard of. But basically, when they were working on the project and finding the best landing sites for the mission, they picked 4 and named them after Egyptian birds to keep with the Egyptian bird Bennu kind of theme. So she tried to create that perspective of standing on the asteroid rather than looking at it from space, which is what pictures probably would show us. And she says, just things about our process that the general public or anybody that doesn't work on the mission wouldn't be aware of. They can sort of see how we do things, and I think that's cool. And it might inspire other people to get into science and say, oh, that looks like interesting work. That might be something I would want to do. So those are all the interviews I had. And here's a graph of basically the interview focuses. Most of the artists kind of talked about the same sort of things, agreed on basically everything. So here is a summary of what the interview focused on, what the artist specifically mentioned or discussed or felt about their art and communicating art through science. And it's a little bit cut off. There were 11 interviews. I'm not sure why it stopped itself at 10, but all of the artists I talked to were positive toward integrating art and science, using them together to communicate difficult or far-fetched, not quite far-fetched, but unusual topics. All of them were also really positive about bridging the gap. So they were positive about art being able to help bridge the gap between the public and science. 9 of the artists expressed feelings that scientists sometimes have difficulty communicating their work. They don't quite know how to make it easier to understand without dumbing it down. They don't want it to be misunderstood or take away from the work that they're doing. So they sometimes have a hard time getting that across. 8 of the artists said that they use their art to make science more meaningful to people and inspiring. Inspire them to maybe not understand everything, but to learn a little bit more, maybe go Google something after going to see the art show. 7 expressly said that they use their art to communicate science. They're communicating via their art. They're taking these science topics and presenting them in a different way. What was interesting is 7 of the artists I talked to specifically mentioned accessibility and increasing audience diversity. So they use their art to make science and art more accessible to a wider audience of people, to more people who are either, visually impaired, for example, who are able to touch the art, or people who are interested in art more than science, but are using art as a way to love science. So then 6 of the artists said that they use their art to make science more tangible, attainable, reachable, and inviting. So science can be really unapproachable for a lot of people. Some people might think that they're not smart enough, or they're not focused or interested in science because it's really hard, but that's really not true. And art is a way of making science more inviting to those people. This also plays to the fact of countering negative opinions about science in the same sort of way. So 5 artists specifically talk about their art being used to way to counter those negative opinions about science. 5 specifically said that they thought that scientists were open to communicating in different ways. So, for example, creating and participating in the Art of Planetary Science as a planetary science art show, as an example. And then 4 specifically said that their use of art helps create an emotional appeal and connection to science. So humans are very emotional. They don't always think rationally, but art is a better way to put emotion in something that's traditionally emotionless, walls of text and numbers and confusion. So that's basically everything. If you have any questions, feel free to reach out to me. I'd be happy to chat about this. I could go on about this forever, as you can see. But yeah, here are my sources. Thank you very much for listening.